The rain battered the windows of the old Victorian house, each drop a reminder of the storm brewing inside. Clara Hensley sat at the mahogany dining table, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her grandmother's will. At 30, Clara had the kind of face that held both youth and wisdom-sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Framed by chestnut hair, she kept loosely tied back. The room smelled of polished wood and memories, every corner whispering stories of her grandmother, Eleanor, who had raised her after her parents' car accident when she was 6. Eleanor had been more than a guardian. She was Clara's compass, her confidant, her anchor. Now, Eleanor was gone. Her funeral just 3 days passed, and Clara felt the weight of her absence like a stone in her chest. The will, handwritten in Eleanor's elegant script, lay open before her. Its words of final gift, the family estate, a modest savings account, and a collection of rare books Eleanor had cherished. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything Clara had left of her. She ran her thumb over the ink, as if touching the words could bring her grandmother back. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through her thoughts. Clara frowned, glancing at the clock nearly 9 p.m. Who would come unannounced on a night like this? She rose, smoothing her sweater, and opened the door to find her uncle, Richard Hensley, standing on the porch. His expensive coat was soaked, his silver hair slicked back, and his eyes carried a glint she'd learned to distrust years ago. At 60, Richard was a man who wore his ambition like a second skin, his smile too polished, his words too calculated. "Clara," he said, stepping inside without invitation, shaking rain from his coat. "We need to talk." She closed the door, her stomach tightening. Richard hadn't attended Eleanor's funeral, hadn't called or written since the news of her passing. His presence now felt like an intrusion, a crack in the fragile peace she'd been trying to hold on to. "About what?" she asked, keeping her voice steady as she led him to the dining room. Richard's eyes flicked to the will on the table, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your grandmother's estate. It's a lot for someone your age to handle alone, don't you think?" Clara's jaw tightened. She'd heard this tone before, patronizing, laced with an agenda. Richard had always been the charming one in the family, the one who could talk his way into or out of anything. But Clara wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't fooled by his charm. "I'm managing," she said, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Uncle Richard?" He sat down, unbuttoning his coat with deliberate slowness. "I'm here to help you, Clara. That inheritance, it's a burden. The taxes, the upkeep on this old house, the legal complexities. I've been in business long enough to know it's too much for you. I'd like to take it off your hands." Her pulse quickened. "Take it off my hands? You mean by it?" "Not exactly." He leaned forward, his voice smooth as silk. "Sign it over to me. I'll manage it. Make sure it's handled properly. You can move on with your life. Focus on your little teaching job, your books. You don't need this kind of responsibility." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. Richard's construction company, Hensley Developments, had been struggling for years, a fact he thought he'd hidden from the family. But Clara had always been observant, catching the whispers of unpaid suppliers, the rumors of shady deals. Eleanor had taught her to listen, to watch, to never trust a smile that didn't match the eyes. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Richard chuckled, a sound that grated on her nerves. "I'm family, Clara. I'm looking out for you. But if you must know, I could use the assets to stabilize my business. It's what Eleanor would have wanted, keeping the family legacy strong." The mention of her grandmother's name from his lips felt like a violation. Clara's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Eleanor left this to me," she said, Not you. Richard's smile faded, replaced by a harder edge. Don't be naive. Clara, you're out of your depth. Sign the papers, and we'll avoid any complications. The word hung in the air like a threat. Clara's heart pounded, but she kept her face composed. She'd spent years learning to mask her emotions, a skill honed in the shadow of Richard's manipulations. As a child, she'd watched him charm Eleanor into lending him money, only to see it vanish into his failing ventures. She wouldn't let him take this from her too. I'll think about it, she said, standing to signal the conversation was over. Richard didn't move. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she saw something darker in them: desperation. Perhaps. Or greed. Don't take too long, he said, rising at last. I'd hate for this to get messy. As the door closed behind him, Clara sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. She looked at the will again, her grandmother's words a reminder of who she was. Eleanor had believed in her, had trusted her with this legacy, and Clara would protect it, no matter what Richard thought he could take. The next morning, Clara woke to the scent of coffee and the soft hum of the radio in the kitchen. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying Richard's visit, his words looping like a warning. She poured herself a cup, the warmth grounding her as she sat at the table, now cleared of the will. She'd locked it in Eleanor's old safe, hidden behind a painting in the study. Richard's sudden interest in her inheritance wasn't just greed, it was too urgent, too calculated. She needed to know why. Clara wasn't a stranger to digging for answers. Her job as a high school history teacher had taught her the value of research, of piecing together fragments to uncover truth. But this wasn't a dusty archive or a classroom debate. This was personal. She opened her laptop and began searching for anything she could find on Hensley Developments. The company's website was polished, boasting projects that looked impressive but lacked recent updates. Public records, however, told a different story: unpaid taxes, lawsuits from contractors, and a plummeting stock value. Richard had been borrowing heavily to keep the company afloat, but the numbers didn't add up. How was he still operating? And why was he so desperate for her inheritance? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her friend Mia, a financial analyst who'd always had a knack for untangling corporate messes. Clara had mentioned Richard's visit in passing last night, and Mia had promised to look into it. Call me. Found something weird. The text read. Clara dialed immediately. What's up? She asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Mia didn't waste time. Hensley Developments is a house of cards. Richard's been siphoning money into offshore accounts, and there's a paper trail leading to some shady investors. But here's the kicker: your grandmother owned a chunk of his company. Clara's breath caught. What? How? Eleanor bought shares years ago, back when Richard was begging for capital to save the business. She never told you? No, Clara said, her mind reeling. Eleanor had always been private about her finances, but this was a bombshell. How many shares? Enough to have a say in the company. And here's the thing: that you read in your name now. Eleanor transferred them to you before she died. Clara's heart raced. She remembered a vague conversation with Eleanor a year ago. Something about securing your future. At the time, Clara had thought it was just her grandmother's way of encouraging her teaching career. Now, it felt like a chess move, one Eleanor had played with precision. Are you saying I own part of Richard's company? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Exactly, Mia said. And from what I can tell, Richard doesn't know. The transfer was quiet, buried in legal paperwork. If he's pushing for your inheritance, he might think it includes those shares, or he's trying to keep you from finding out. Clara thanked Mia and hung up, her mind spinning. She needed to see those documents. She drove to Eleanor's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a kind man in his 70s who'd known her grandmother for decades. His office was a small, cluttered space filled with books and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. When Clara explained Richard's visit, Thompson's face grew serious. "Your grandmother was a sharp woman," he said, pulling a file from his desk. "She knew Richard's weaknesses. When she bought those shares, she did it to protect you. They're yours now, 20% of Hensley Developments." Clara stared at the documents. Her grandmother's signature a familiar flourish. 20% wasn't enough to control the company, but it was enough to make Richard nervous. Enough to give her leverage. "Did she ever tell Richard?" Clara asked. Thompson shook his head. "She didn't trust him. Said he'd try to manipulate you if he knew. She wanted you to have the upper hand." Clara left the office with the documents clutched to her chest, a mix of pride and fear swelling inside her. Eleanor had given her more than an inheritance. She'd given her power. But power came with danger, especially when Richard was involved. That night, Clara sat in the study, the documents spread out before her. She wasn't just fighting for a house or a savings account. She was fighting for her grandmother's legacy, for the trust Eleanor had placed in her. And she wouldn't let Richard take that away. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Clara spent her evenings poring over financial reports, learning the ins and outs of Hensley Developments. She wasn't a businesswoman, but she was a quick study, and Mia's guidance helped her understand the company's fragile state. Richard had been hiding losses, juggling debts, and making promises to investors he couldn't keep. The shares Clara held were a ticking time bomb if she used them strategically. She could expose him. Richard called daily, his tone growing more insistent. "Have you thought about my offer?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with false concern. Clara played along, saying she needed time, all while gathering evidence. She found emails between Richard and a shady lender, hinting at deals that skirted the edge of legality. She wasn't sure what she'd do with the information, but knowledge was her weapon. On Friday, Richard showed up again, this time with a lawyer in tow, a slick man named Victor who carried a briefcase and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They sat in the dining room, the air thick with tension. Clara had prepared for this, her documents hidden, but her resolve unshaken. "Let's make this simple," Richard said, sliding a contract across the table. "Sign over the estate, and I'll take care of everything. You'll get a fair sum, enough to start fresh." Clara glanced at the contract, her heart steady despite the pressure. "And if I don't?" Victor spoke up, his voice smooth but cold. "There could be legal challenges, probate disputes, questions about the will's validity. It could drag on for years. Clara, you don't want that." She leaned back, studying them both. Richard's jaw was tight, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. He was counting on her to fold, to be the naive niece he could bully. But Clara had spent years watching him, learning his tactics. She wasn't that girl anymore. "I've been doing some research," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Hensley Developments isn't doing well, is it, Uncle Richard? Unpaid debts, angry investors. You need cash, and you thought you could take it from me." Richard's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do." Clara stood, retrieving a folder from the sideboard. She placed it on the table, letting the weight of it speak for itself. "I know about the shares. The ones Eleanor bought. The ones she transferred to me." The room went silent. Victor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Richard, whose composure cracked for the first time. "What shares?" he asked, but his voice wavered. 20% of your company," Clara said, her eyes locked on his. "I own them. And from what I've learned, that's enough to call a shareholders' meeting." Enough to ask questions about your creative accounting. Richard's face flushed red, his hands gripping the table. You're bluffing. Am I? Clara opened the folder, revealing the share certificates and financial reports Mia had helped her compile. I've been in touch with your investors. They're not happy, Richard, and they'll be even less happy when they see this. Victor cleared his throat, sensing the shift in power. Perhaps we should discuss this further. No. Clara cut him off. You came here thinking you could intimidate me. But I'm not signing anything. And if you push this, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've been hiding. Richard stared at her, his mask of charm gone, replaced by raw anger. But beneath it, Clara saw fear. He was cornered, and he knew it. This isn't over, he said, standing abruptly. Victor followed, grabbing his briefcase as they stormed out. Clara exhaled, her legs trembling as the door slammed shut. She'd won this round, but the fight was far from over. Richard wouldn't give up easily, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Clara knew she couldn't stay on the defensive. Richard was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. She spent the next few days strategizing with Mia, who connected her with a corporate lawyer named Sarah, an old college friend with a reputation for taking down corrupt executives. Sarah was in her 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a sharp mind that matched Clara's determination. They met at a small cafe, away from prying eyes. Sarah reviewed the documents, her eyes narrowing as she read. This is explosive, she said, tapping the folder. Richard's been cooking the books for years. With your shares, you have enough leverage to demand an audit. If what you found is true, he could face criminal charges. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. What do I need to do? Call a shareholders meeting, Sarah said. Present the evidence. Force transparency. But be careful, Richard's not above playing dirty. Clara spent the next week preparing, gathering statements from former employees who'd been stiffed by Richard, emails from investors who'd been misled. She felt like she was channeling Eleanor, who'd always taught her to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The meeting was set for the following Monday at Hensley Development's headquarters, a sleek glass building that hid the rot within. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a tailored blazer and skirt that made her feel like she belonged in the boardroom. She carried the folder of evidence, her heart pounding but her steps steady. The boardroom was filled with investors, most of them older men who eyed Clara with skepticism. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of confidence. But Clara caught the way his fingers tapped nervously against his pen. Miss Hensley, he said as she entered, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a surprise. I didn't realize you had an interest in corporate matters. I have an interest in the truth, Clara said, taking a seat. She opened her folder, her voice steady as she addressed the room. As a shareholder, I'm entitled to raise concerns about the company's management, and I have evidence of financial misconduct. The room buzzed with murmurs. Richard's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. This is absurd. You're out of your depth, Clara. She didn't flinch. Then let's have an independent audit. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind. The investors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Richard's face reddened. But before he could respond, an older man, Mr. Grayson, a major shareholder, spoke up. I second the motion for an audit. We've been hearing rumors for too long. Clara felt a surge of triumph as the vote passed. Richard's control was slipping, and he knew it. As the meeting adjourned, he approached her, his voice low and venomous. You think you've won. You have no idea what you're up against. Clara met his gaze, unflinching. I know exactly what I'm up against, and I'm not afraid. That night, She sat in Eleanor's study, the weight of the day settling over her. She'd taken a stand. But the battle wasn't over. Richard would fight back, and she needed to be ready. But for the first time, she felt like she was honoring her grandmother's legacy, not just protecting it, but building on it. The audit began immediately, and the results came faster than Clara expected. Sarah had pulled strings to expedite the process, and within days, the findings were damning: falsified records, diverted funds, and contracts signed with non-existent companies. Richard had been bleeding Hensley Developments dry, using the money to prop up his lifestyle and pay off personal debts. Clara met with Sarah and Mia to plan their next move. The evidence was enough to remove Richard as CEO. But Clara wanted more than his ousting. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for the employees who'd lost their livelihoods, the investors who'd been deceived, and the memory of her grandmother, who'd trusted her to do what was right. They decided to present the findings to the board and file a formal complaint with the authorities. But before they could, Richard made his move. Clara arrived home one evening to find her front door ajar, the lock tampered with. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, her phone ready to dial 911. The house was untouched except for the study, where papers were scattered across the floor. The safe was open, but the will and share certificates were still there. Clara had moved them to a bank vault days ago. She called the police, who took her statement and promised to investigate. But Clara knew Richard was behind it. He was desperate, grasping at straws to intimidate her. Instead of fear, she felt a surge of anger. He'd underestimated her for the last time. The board meeting was set for the following day. Clara walked in with Sarah by her side, the audit report in hand. The room was tense, the investors' faces grim as they read the findings. Richard tried to deflect, blaming market conditions and bad luck. But his excuses fell flat. Clara stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "My grandmother believed in this company," she said. "She invested in it to help her brother, but also to protect me. Richard betrayed that trust. He betrayed all of you. I'm moving to remove him as CEO and turn this evidence over to the authorities." The vote was unanimous. Richard was stripped of his position, his face a mask of fury as he stormed out. Clara felt no joy in his downfall, only a quiet satisfaction that justice was being served. That evening, she visited Eleanor's grave, the air cool and crisp. She knelt by the headstone, her fingers tracing the engraved name. "I did it, Grandma," she whispered. "I protected what you gave me." But the fight wasn't over. Richard's actions had consequences, and Clara knew she'd need to stay vigilant. She was ready, though ready to honor her grandmother's legacy, ready to face whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, Hensley Developments underwent a transformation. With Richard gone, the board appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Laura who'd been one of the employees Richard had wronged. Clara worked closely with her, using her shares to push for reforms: fair wages, transparent accounting, and a focus on sustainable projects. The company wasn't out of the woods, but it was healing, and Clara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. The authorities charged Richard with fraud and embezzlement. He tried to flee, but his assets were frozen, his offshore accounts exposed. Clara didn't attend his hearings. She didn't need to see him fall to know she'd won. Instead, she focused on the future, on building something that would make Eleanor proud. She kept the Victorian house, turning it into a community space for local book clubs and history lectures. The rare books from Eleanor's collection became the heart of a small library, a place where stories could live on. Clara continued teaching, finding joy in her students' curiosity. But she also took on a role as an advisor to Hensley Developments, ensuring her grandmother's investment wasn't wasted. One evening, as she sat in the study, a letter arrived from Mr. Thompson. Inside was a note from Eleanor, written months before her death. Clara. It read, "You've always had the strength to do what's right, even when it's hard. I gave you the shares because I knew you'd use them wisely. Protect our legacy. But more than that, build your own." Clara's eyes stung with tears as she folded the letter. She looked around the study, at the shelves of books, the desk where Eleanor had taught her to read, to think, to fight. This was her legacy, not just the house or the shares, but the courage to stand up, to face greed and deception with truth and resolve. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the moon cast a soft glow through the window. Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. She wasn't just Eleanor's granddaughter anymore. She was Clara Hensley, a woman who'd claimed her place in the world, one bold step at a time.